Welcome back to ABA Beyond the Data. I'm your host, Jay Burton, BCBA, and the dad of two awesome boys who just happen to be on the autism spectrum. This show is designed for behavior analysts and those working in the field of ABA who are looking to bridge the latest research to our actual day-to-day clinical practice. And it is dedicated to providing practical solutions to the practicing clinicians out there. Because we all know, ABA isn't just data points. It's about real people, real families, and the real lives of the clients we work with. And as a parent and a BCBA, the perspectives you will hear on this show will always be a blend of both worlds. My years in the field and my life on the other side of the table as a parent. That's the beyond the data part. It doesn't mean we ignore data. It means we don't hide behind it. We use it to serve the kids we work with. And today's episode is all about data. And yeah, it is research heavy. But I'm going to keep it friendly and bring it down to earth. I'm going to bring you along on a guided tour through some of the most common functional analysis formats you'll hear about in ABA. And I want to set the expectations right out the gate. This is a brief overview episode. Think of it like the trailer for each of the FAs we will review today. We're going to hit the background, the research support, and the basics of how it works for each of the formats we're looking at. But we're not going to do a deep dive into the training that each of these FAs truly require and should receive. And I'm sure later episodes will do just that. Dive deep into each of these FAs. But today is just the trailers. So if you've ever felt like I kind of know these FAs, but I don't know what they actually look like, that's the point of this series. Today we're building the map. And in later episodes, we'll walk the trails and climb the mountains. But today, we're just setting course for what future episodes may look like on this topic. And let me just take a second to say that it is critical to at least have a foundational knowledge here. In the literature, the functional analysis is often described as the gold standard because it allows us to systematically manipulate reinforcement contingencies and identify what variables are most likely maintaining problem behaviors. And the research base is massive. Like literally, it's massive. By 2012, there were nearly 1,000 published replications or variations of the original FA methodology. At the same time, surveys have found that the majority of BCBAs report never or almost never using FA methods in practice, with the most common barriers being time and resources. That gap between what we know works, between the thousands of articles out there that have said this empirically works, and what we actually do in this field is exactly what we're going to talk about today. But before we get into any of that, a quick CEU update. This show is ACE approved, and I try to keep the process simple. In older episodes, you'll hear me give 3 keywords that you could use to purchase CEUs. But because of updates from the BACB that go into effect in July 2026, the podcast CEU process is shifting away from keywords. So going forward, instead of a code word, you're going to answer 5 quick knowledge check questions about the episode. And don't worry, this doesn't affect CEUs you've already earned, and it doesn't change anything about the keyword episodes you've already purchased. The BACB will still accept those. This is really provider stress, not listener stress. I'll also be updating and re-releasing older episodes over time, so the whole library stays aligned with the new requirements. For the new process, it goes like this. You listen to the episode first, then you go to aba-ceus.com and click Get CEUs. Find the episode, add it to the cart, and during checkout, you'll answer 5 questions about what we covered. They're not meant to be tricky. They're meant to show that you listened and that you got something from it. You can even miss one and still pass if you miss more than 80%. And trust me, most of you will not if you actually listened. The answers are not going to be too tricky, but I will send an email to you if you only missed two to see if you would like to retry on the ones that you missed, or if you would just like a refund. If you missed them all, I'm just going to automatically issue a refund. After that, you will receive your certificate within 24 to 48 hours. And please bear in mind that I am manually checking all of your answers and manually creating your certificate. So, if I get your order while I'm in session or chasing my own kids around the house, it may take me a minute or two to get around to it. All right, so here's where we're heading today. First, we're going to do a quick history lesson on why functional analysis exists and how it became such a central technology in behavioral analysis. Then we'll walk through the standard analog FA, the classic Iwata model, and what it's designed to do. After that, we'll move into brief functional analysis and why the field's starting experimenting with efficiency. Then we'll cover precursor functional analysis and how analyzing earlier, smaller behaviors can sometimes help us do safer and more practical assessments. Then, from there, we'll talk about synthesized approaches, which are modern approaches which include the interview informed synthesized contingency analysis and the practical functional assessment model. We're going to talk about what they are, what the research says, and what practitioners should understand about what's being tested specifically. So let's dive on in and see how we got here because the why matters before the how. But before we get into the different formats, I want to make sure we're all talking about the same thing when we say functional analysis because people use FA like it's one single procedure. It's not, it's a logic and a philosophy. In the plainest language possible, a functional analysis is when we systematically test which consequences are reinforcing problem behavior by arranging conditions. That's it. We're not just saying, well, it looks like attention or it feels like escape. And don't lie, we've all been there when we've done that. We're setting up situations where the consequences we're curious about is delivered under a specific condition. And then we watch what happens. If behavior reliably goes up in that condition and it stays lower in a well designed control, we have a defensible conclusion about what's maintaining it. And just to be clear, we're not talking about functional assessments. A functional assessment might include interviews, checklists, record reviews, and descriptive observation. Those are useful, and sometimes absolutely necessary, but they don't isolate variables. A functional analysis is the experimental step, our closest thing to running a mini study on the behavior in real time. And this idea of arranging conditions and testing sounds obvious to a behavior analyst in 2026 because functional based treatment is baked into our training, but that wasn't always the case. In their 2003 review, Hanley, Iwata, and McCord described functional analysis methodology as focusing on identifying variables that influence problem behaviors, and they called it a hallmark of contemporary approaches to behavioral assessments. In other words, it's not just a tool we sometimes use, it's one of the core technologies that moved our field from guessing to demonstrating. The historical pivot most people point to is the article by Brian Iwata and colleagues, and the title of this origin story is Towards a Functional Analysis of Self-Injury. Kind of got that ring of of an old-timey quest. I don't know why, but it just kind of does, doesn't it? And I guess for Iwata and his colleagues, it kind of was a quest to figure out what the function of a behavior was. And in that study, The authors describe using an operant methodology to assess functional relationships between self injury and specific environmental events. They observed self injury during brief, repeated exposures to a series of analog conditions, and each condition systematically differed in the things like whether play materials were available, whether demands were placed, and whether social attention was absent, non contingent, or delivered contingent on self injury. One detail I love about that paper is that it doesn't pretend behavior is neat. They reported, and this is way back in the day, right before modern approaches that we'll talk about later indicated the same sort of thing. They reported a great deal of variability both between participants and within participants. That matches real life, but the reason this approach changed the field is that for 6 of the 9 participants, higher levels of self injury were consistently associated with a specific stimulus condition. Translation: for many individuals, the behavior wasn't random, and it wasn't just in the person, it was sensitive to the environmental arrangements, and that meant we could do something about it. While that is significant, it is surprisingly low percentage if you really think about it. Just 66% showing a consistent variable in the trials. Fast forward from there, and the standard analog functional analysis, what many people call the Iwata-style FA, becomes what literature sometimes called the gold standard. In the article that we're reviewing for this episode by Coffey and colleagues, they noted that Iwata's FA method had been referred to as the gold standard because of how much they influenced functional assessment technology. And that label makes sense because the method is built around direct manipulation of contingencies. And from this point, the research base explodes. By 2012, there were almost 1,000 published replications or variations of the original functional analysis method. Almost 1,000, guys, and by now I'm sure it is well beyond that. That tells you two things. One, the standard FA is absolutely foundational, but two, the field has been modifying and adapting it for decades. Settings are different, staff skill levels differ, risk levels differ, and the original ideal version isn't always feasible in the environments we actually work in. Which brings us to the real world reality check. In that same coffee paper, they cite a survey where 63% of BCBAs reported never or almost never using functional analysis methods to identify problem behaviors. 63%. And the most common barriers listed were a lack of time and resources. And if you don't feel that as a BCBA, like you can't do an all day or several day FA, we are on the same page. If you've ever had a caseload that feels like a triage unit, you're understanding this. It's one thing to run a beautiful analog FA with multiple conditions, trained staff, safety equipment, safety trained staff, and protected time. It's another thing to try to do it when you're covering staffing gaps, you're writing authorizations, the parents are exhausted and complaining and trying to get support from you, the schools are calling, SOPs are trying to check in, and the behavior you're dealing with is severe enough that let's evoke it for assessment purposes feels like a real ethical weight. So here's the thesis for this entire episode, and I want to say it plainly. The goal isn't do Iwata FA or nothing. The goal is to stay function based and to choose the most defensible analysis you can run safely. If you can run a full analog FA with strong control and clean conditions and in an ethical way, great. But if you can't, that doesn't mean you abandon the science and start treating based purely on gut feeling. It means that when an FA needs to be done, choose an FA format that preserves experimental logic while fitting into the constraints of being a BCBA. That's why these variants exist. Brief FAs are the field's response to time constraints. Precursor analysis are the field's response to safety constraints, and the synthesized interview informed approaches like IISCA and the broader practical functional assessment process are the field's attempt to match the complexity of real contexts where behavior is often maintained by combined variables, not a single clean contingency. And I think it's also important to pause for a moment and to remember not every behavior we're recording needs an FA completed. Sometimes the function of behavior is deadpan obvious. I found this especially to be the case in early intervention. Not universal, but is common. But for older kiddos who exhibit complex behaviors that seem to be having varying triggers, FAs are essential. They're also essential for specific protocols such as skill based training. But I don't want you to walk away from this episode thinking that you aren't doing your job because you're not doing FAs at every behavior that's popping up. Because the reality is that's impossible. And I don't care what the white lab coat folks say. Like, unless you live in a real life clinic where you have all these constraints, like, we have to have a certain number of case sizes to make this financially stable for the organizations that we work in. We have to work within the constraints of our field. And we also have to decide what's ethically appropriate for our clients and what is the best use of our time for them. So we got the history. Let's start off with the classic and look deeper into the Iwata method. When you read a research article and they say we ran an FA, most of the time what they mean is some version of a standard analog functional analysis. That is the Iwata-style model. And I want to demystify the language right away because analog can sound more complicated than it is. All analog means is that you're creating a small, controlled little snapshot of the situation where the problem behavior usually happens. You're doing it in a way where you can test a hypothesized function. And in this format, everything revolves around one simple idea: test versus control. The control condition, often called play, is the condition where you do your best to remove the motivation to engage in a problem behavior. You give non contingent attention, access to preferred items, and you keep demands low. Then the test condition are the ones where you set up a specific establishing operation and you deliver a specific consequence contingent on the problem behavior. That contrast is the whole game. That is the whole test. If behavior stays low in control and reliably increases in one test condition, it's hard to argue with what you're seeing, right? The most common set of conditions you'll hear about in modern practices are attention, escape, or demand, it's one and the same, tangible, alone, or automatic, and player control. Now, it's worth noting that in the original Iwata paper toward a functional analysis of self injury, they weren't using the exact same 5 condition menu that gets taught in every BCBA program today, that gets taught to all the RBTs. Their analog, and I know, right? That's crazy. Like, those weren't just always around. My mind was kind of blown when I read that in the research, right? But their analog conditions differed across 3 main dimensions: whether play materials were present, whether demands were high or low, and whether social attention was absent, non-contingent, or contingent. In that study, they described a social disapproval condition where attention was delivered contingent on self injury in the form of a statement of concern or disapproval, such as, don't do that, or, oh, sweetie, are you okay? Things like that, right? And in the demand, they described an academic demand condition where tasks were presented and self injury produced a break. They described the alone condition designed to approximate what they called an impoverished environment where minimal stimulation is available and the behavior might be maintained by sensory consequences. And then they describe the play condition, an enriched environment, basically where self injury should be least likely to occur if the behavior is
socially maintained. So when you hear Iwata-style or analog FA, don't get stuck on the label. It's really not that complex. It's, did it occur in the control? Did it control in the tested variable or not, right? You're testing whether your behavior is sensitive to positive reinforcement like attention, negative reinforcement, escape, or automatic reinforcement. It is basic when you look at it like that, right? And the reason this model is powerful is because of experimental control. In their 2000 review, Hanley, Iwata, and McCord describe the basic methodology like this: direct observation and repeated measurement of problem behaviors under test and control conditions where some environmental variable is manipulated. Then they highlight what made the Iwata model so influential. Iwata and colleagues had proposed a general model for concurrently assessing the sensitivity of self injury to contingencies of positive, negative, and automatic reinforcement. They did that by conducting repeated measurements across conditions arranged in a multi element single subject design, meaning conditions altered so you can compare levels quickly. And here's a phrase from that review I think is worth saying out loud. Each test condition contains an establishing operation, a discriminative stimulus, a source of reinforcement for a given contingency, while those operations and contingencies are absent from the control condition. That sentence is basically the blueprint for running this well. You are giving clear contingencies that should evoke a problem behavior, and if that contingency is matching up with the behavior occurring, boom, you got it. It's there. You know what the cause, what the function really is. This is simple stuff, guys. I mean, it sounds complicated, but when you really look at it, you simply have a discriminative stimulus, a source of a way to escape or a way to get access, right? You have a discriminative stimulus being put in the presence of the child, and essentially, when that discriminative stimulus is there and the behavior is occurring, boom, you can figure out the function. But, and this is where I want to keep the tone real, strong evidence doesn't automatically mean it's easy to implement. The standard analog FA can be beautiful when it's done well, but it also demands a lot: time, staffing, training, good stimulus control, and a safety plan you can actually trust. So let's run through what this should actually look like. First, you start with safety and ethics because you're intentionally arranging conditions where problem behaviors might happen. That means you need to be thoughtful about the medical variables when relevant, especially for severe SIB or severe aggression or anything that might need additional support, training, or equipment. You need a clear stop criteria before you start. If we see X intensity, or if we see this number of occurrences within this amount of time, or if the interval ends and we switch to a safety protocol, then it needs to end. And this is where you also need to decide who in the room is in charge, what room you're going to use, what the room setup is going to look like, whether there are sharp edges or objects in the room, and what the response will be to a more escalated situation. The last thing you ever want to be doing is improvising safety in the middle of an FA. Second, you need to operationally define the behavior and you pick a measurement system your team can actually do. For a lot of problem behaviors, rate per minute is your friend because it's sensitive and easier to graph across conditions. But if you're dealing with tantrum like behavior that is more continuous duration, is probably going to be what makes sense, right? The point isn't to pick the most academic measurement system. The point is to pick one that you can reliably and consistently do across conditions. That's the most important aspect. Third, you identify the likely reinforcers and the likely establishing operation. And I want to be really honest here. Nobody does this blind. Even in the Iwata way, we're using information from caregivers, whether that's records and observation or talking to the other therapists that have worked with them. So do an interview, watch a bit, ask when does this happen and what usually triggers it to occur, right? And then use that information to choose the conditions. If tangibles really have never been part of it, then don't run a tangible condition. Fourth, you build your control condition, the play condition. The control is not just no demands, it's designed to make problem behaviors unnecessary. In play, you're providing attention freely, you're providing access to pervert items, and you're not placing demands that would evoke escape maintain behavior. This is where the whole FA can succeed or fail. Because if your control condition is weak, like the client is bored, or there are no actual preferred items, or even low minor demands being placed, you'll end up with an untrue comparison. You'll end up thinking everything is the function because the behaviors happen everywhere. And then you move into your fifth step. You build your test conditions one at a time. In attention condition, attention is delivered contingent on the problem behavior, and everything else is ignored. That's very similar to how Iwata described social disapproval, attention in the form of concern, disapproval, or brief contact. In the escape condition, you present demands and the break is contingent on problem behavior. In the tangible condition, you remove a preferred item and the return of that item is contingent on problem behavior. And then in the alone or the ignore condition, you provide minimal stimulation and no social consequence, only if it's safe and clinically appropriate, because this is where you're testing whether the behavior persists without social reinforcement, which points you toward an automatic function. And across all of these, you're keeping one thing sacred: the contingency. You don't accidentally give escape in the attention condition. You don't start bargaining in the tangible. You don't add attention in alone. Clean conditions. You are operating in isolation. You also need to choose your design. You got two options. You can do the multi element design, which is common because it's efficient. You alternate conditions rapidly, and this allows you to see the differentiation faster. If you're trying to stick to the classic, that's what the original Iwata work did. But multi element can also create interaction effects, especially if conditions aren't well discriminated or if there are carryover conditions that are happening. Like if a child's still upset after removal occurred in the last condition, then in the next condition, that frustration, that behavior might still be there. That's where pairwise can be a cleaner method. Pairwise basically means you alternate one test condition with the control condition until you're confident, and then you move to the next test. This does take longer. You're not rapidly going through all the different conditions, but it reduces confusion and sometimes gives you clearer results, especially in real world, outpatient, or school settings. And finally, you interpret the data with a simple rule of thumb. If problem behavior is consistently higher in one condition than in the control, that condition is likely a strong candidate for the function. You're looking for patterns, not one dramatic data point, but replication does matter, right? That's why we don't run one attention interval and call it attention maintained. We look for consistency and repeated exposure. So, seeing a pattern is important across the intervals. And here's the practical coaching line I want you to remember because it applies to every FA you'll ever run. If your RBT can't describe what makes one condition different than another, then the FA is already broken. It's already leaking across conditions. Your conditions have to be discriminable. Your team should be able to say with confidence in this condition, demands happen and problem behaviors produce break. Versus in this condition, I'm ignoring unless the behavior happens. It has to be truly clear to see. So that's the classic model. But what happens when you don't have the luxury of running multiple 15-minute intervals across 5 conditions? That's the whole reason brief functional analysis exists, because clinicians were staring at very real problem behaviors and saying, okay, the standard analog FA is powerful and obviously the gold standard, but how do we do this in the real world when we've got limited windows, limited staff, and a family that needs answers now? That's the context I want you to hold in your head. Brief FAs didn't show up because the field got tired of being scientific, right? We simply were restrained by the constraints that our field exists in. And the simplest way to define a brief FA is this: it's a condensed experimental test designed to get differentiation quickly. You're still testing function, you're still manipulating contingencies, you're just doing it in a way that fits inside the time constraints of actual service delivery. A good reference for this is Northup and colleagues in 1991 titled A Brief Functional Analysis of Aggressive and Alternative Behaviors in Out Clinic Setting. And what they did was incredibly practical. They said basically, we want to know if this can be done during a 90-minute period that looks like a typical outpatient psychological evaluation. And then they did it. They conducted what they called a brief functional analysis made up of a series of analog conditions lasting 10 minutes or less and implemented during 1 day outpatient evaluation. And I want you to hear how bold that was for the time. Participants were not easy cases. These were individuals referred for aggressive behavior, severe, long standing, high rate aggression, who also had limited communication. Okay. These were not soft cases. These were not the easy ones, right? They were not setting themselves up for a home run. Northup and colleagues weren't trying to prove it works on a mild, convenient behavior. They were trying to see if this could actually work in more severe, more complicated cases. They were saying, can we do functional analysis logic in a setting where the clock is running and the stakes are high? And what makes this paper especially important is that they didn't stop at, we think the function is attention, or we think function is escape. They built an additional component into the 90-minute model that I think is one of the most underrated parts of the whole brief FA conversation. They added what they called a contingency reversal component. And the idea was simple, but it's powerful. Once you identify the contingency maintaining aggression, you can immediately test whether the same contingency will also reinforce an appropriate replacement response. In other words, you can move from assessment to a mini treatment demonstration right there in the assessment window. So when we talk about validation for brief FAs, that's what we mean. It doesn't mean that brief FA is always perfect or as thorough as running multiple intervals across multiple days with full experimental controls. What it means is that it can identify likely maintaining variables fast enough to inform treatment decisions in a constrained context. It gives you actionable direction. It gives a defensible hypothesis you can begin treating immediately, especially when doing nothing or doing only indirect assessments leaves you stuck in guesswork, right? But this is important, fast doesn't mean sloppy. Brief FAs only work when you keep the experimental logic intact, and that means you have to be strategic. So let's talk about how you can actually run one of these in a way that's clinically reasonable. And the first decision is whether a brief FA is even the right tool for the case in front of you. I tend to think of brief FAs as the right move when risk is moderate, time is limited, and you need a quick direction to guide treatment. Clinics are a classic example. Another example is a school consult where you can't carve out 3 hours across multiple days to run a full analysis, but you can embed a short test control comparison within visit. On the flip side, there are times you should not choose a brief FA. If you have a high risk self injury and you don't have proper safety support, you don't get brave just because you're on the schedule. And you're also not going to use it if the behavior is low frequency, so low that you're unlikely to catch it during short intervals, during a brief trial. Because really, there's not going to be a clear differentiation between each one if there's not enough data. But once you've decided it makes sense, the next step is to narrow your target. This is where brief FAs differ from standard run the whole menu approach. In a brief model, you usually don't test everything. You usually use an interview to gauge exactly what the behavior is looking like and where and when it's occurring. And then you do quick observation to do a quick pick of the top one or two suspected functions. And you do that honestly. If the parents say it's always when I remove the iPad and the data you observe supports that, you don't need to spend precious minutes running every single condition. If there's a secondary one that also seems like a probable one, then add that one in as well. But if the other conditions seem absolutely like they will not be occurring, then do not run them. If it is just one function that seems to be clear, but you just want to make sure, then just run that single one. You start where the evidence points and then expand out if you're not getting clear results. And because this is brief, you run short intervals. Northup's model used conditions lasting no more than 10 minutes and did not exceed 90 minutes for the total evaluation. You can also do 5-minute intervals depending on risk and practicality. But the key is not the exact number, the key is you maintain test control comparison. So, in practical terms, you might alternate a test condition and control condition a couple of times. You're looking for differentiation, though, not perfection. And if you can replicate, meaning you can see the same pattern again, you do it. Even one extra exposure can improve your confidence dramatically, but you look for that pattern as quickly as possible. But now, here's where I want to slow down and get really practical. If you're going to switch conditions quickly like this, the client has to be able to discriminate them. In a brief FA, you don't have time for the environment to teach the difference slowly. You have to make the difference obvious, extremely obvious. That can be as simple as using a different therapist for different conditions, like one's always being the demand placer, one's always doing the attention function, one's always doing the escape, right? You can also do different colored materials, different colored shirts, or clear interval cues like work time versus free time. The point is stimulus control. If a client can't tell which condition they're in, you won't get clean data. You'll get a nice little blend between them because of how rapidly the conditions are changing. And then we get to the part of Northup's paper that I think makes it so clinically useful, the contingency reversal component. After they identified the condition associated with the highest level of aggression for each participant, they flipped the script. Instead of delivering that maintaining contingency for aggression, they delivered it for a specific appropriate man. For some participants, that was a simple please sign. For another, it was saying, come here, please. And then they tested whether strengthening that alternative response with the same reinforcer that used to maintain aggression would reduce aggression and increase communication. They described this as an evaluation of equivalency, whether the same contingency would maintain the replacement behavior as well as it maintained the aggression. And the results were fast. And their discussion, they highlight that this investigation showed rapid effects, decreases in aggressive behavior, and increases in the alternative manding response. They also make a conceptual point that I love. These results provided direct evidence of the treatment utility of functional analysis. In other words, the assessment wasn't just a label maker, it pointed directly to an effective intervention pathway. And that's the heart of what validated means, right? A brief FA doesn't need to be a perfect, exhaustive experiment to be valuable. It needs to be accurate enough to point you toward a function based treatment that works and fast enough to fit the real constraints of outpatient, of typical clinic practices. Now, what do you do if your brief FA is unclear? What if you run intervals and the data is messy? This is where good clinicians don't force an answer. If it's unclear, you have a few defensible moves. You can extend the brief FA, same logic, more intervals, right? You can shift to a pairwise format where you test one suspected function against control until it's clear, right? Or you can move to a different format that fits the barriers you're facing. If time is a barrier, you might move to a more focused evaluation, right? If safety is the barrier, you might move to a precursor analysis. And if the complexity of the situation that's triggering the behavior is too much of a barrier, like behavior only happens in a specific perfect storm, then the interview informed synthesized approach might be the actual more honest option. All right, well, if brief FAs help with time, precursor FAs help with safety. And if you've ever been in a situation where you thought, I actually do believe in functional analysis, but I can't ethically justify evoking that level of behavior just to prove a point, then precursor functional analysis is the one that's most practical to you. So let's define the term in plain language first. A precursor behavior is an early, low intensity response that reliably shows up before severe behavior you're ultimately trying to reduce, right? It's the warning sign, really, right? It's that check your engine sign popping up. It's what you're seeing right before the escalation, oftentimes within seconds. And when you've seen the pattern enough times that you can almost predict what's coming next, right? That is a precursor behavior. This matters because it gives you an option. You can analyze function while still reducing risk. You can keep that experimental logic of a functional analysis, but shift your attention from the most dangerous topography to something safer, earlier, and more manageable. The anchor paper for the brief FA, is Smith and Churchill in 2002, which was published in the Journal of Applied Behavioral Analysis and titled Identification of Environmental Determinants of Behavior Disorder Through Functional Analysis of Precursor Behaviors. I complain about this in every single episode, but will they ever write a title of a paper that's less than 4 words? I don't think so. But in this study, they weren't studying mild cases. Like many of the other FA designs, they selected clients that had some of the more severe problem behaviors. Each individual in this had severe behaviors that put others or themselves at risk of injury, including hitting others, head banging, severe biting, and additionally, none of them had expressive language. So, of course, this is exactly the kind of population where safety is a large concern, right? So, the obvious problem that Smith and Churchill point out is that doing a proper functional analysis will produce a function, but it will put these individuals or the individuals around them at higher risk of injury. So the authors of this paper did a observation of the individuals and the behaviors that were occurring to determine the exact precursors that were showing up. Then they used those identified precursor behaviors in the FA itself. Everything else in the analog FA remained the same. Therapist numbers, the number of sequence of intervals, the timing, the setting, everything else remains the same. The only thing that changes is that the contingency is being given at the precursor behavior rather than the behavior itself. Now, how do you run this in real practice? It's very similar to FA, but there are some critical differences, right? First, you have to identify the precursors. This starts with a caregiver report and observation. You ask the parents, you ask the RBTs, you ask the teachers, what happens right before it blows up? And you don't accept vague answers like he gets mad. You're looking for observable actions, changes in voice, body positioning, movement patterns. And then from there, you have to confirm it with your own eyes. You need a specific observation of what this really looks like and is it really preceding escalation. And second, you need to validate that the precursor belongs to the same response class. In other words, it tends to happen in the same context and tends to correlate with escalation. It's not popping up randomly in other areas because if that is occurring, then this precursor behavior is likely going to show up across functions.
I think back to the specific case I had in which we ran a precursor FA,
And one of the BCBAs had mentioned that the behavior that had always preceded it was him going to the ground before he started kicking at us. And he was kicking at walls, doors, everything. And that's great. But the thing is that that was happening in every situation. The kid's go to measure was to go to the ground. And so, yes, it was a precursor. And yes, it usually led to something else. But we were specifically looking at the action of kicking, not him engaging in just typical major meltdown tantrums. But one of the RBTs pointed out that right when he goes to the ground, once he's there, he would say, "Hit and kick," whoever the therapist was, right? He would literally just say, "Hit and kick," and that is about as obvious of a precursor as you can get. And finally, you really need to define the precursor behavior, and this is critical because precursors are way less obvious and can be nuanced in very subtle ways, right? And so you need to make sure that your definition is understandable, but it's also objective. I would honestly say, unless they are simply saying, "I'm going to hit you," precursor behavior definitions can be a lot more complex than typical definitions. So you really need to make sure that you have a clear, objective definition that your staff can clearly identify and measure. And then from there, you're just following classic analog FA. I mean, there's really no difference there. While I will not pin any single one of these down as my own personal favorite, precursors are definitely one that I have gone to on multiple occasions because a good portion of my career has been with the more severe older kiddos where we were having more severe instances of severe behavior and we couldn't go into a classic FA. And especially earlier in my career, I mean, I was just unaware of the synthesized approach. I mean, honestly, Dr. Hantley's work was just coming out at that time. So precursors was a huge thing for me earlier in my career. Nowadays, I don't know if I would go straight to that one as much as I would, but it definitely serves its purpose and it definitely has a huge benefit to it when you are considering safety. Which brings me to the final approach, which is the synthesized approach. And I want you to hear this the right way. This isn't the anti Iwata movement. I have heard that from professionals out there that this is a shortcut, a cheat, but that is not at all what this is. At its best, this is a very intentional attempt to keep functional analysis logic intact while matching what actually happens in real families and real classrooms and real clinics, where problem behaviors often aren't triggered by one clean variable at a time. And I think if you have been doing this for a while, you've seen it complex behaviors that seem to have multiple functions, multiple triggers. The way Hanley and colleagues describe this assessment process, and this is coming out of their 2014 paper in Java, is that they wanted to increase efficacy while preserving scientific rigor. And the key move they emphasize is starting with an open ended interview to identify the type of contingencies that may influence problem behavior. Then those interview results are used to design individualized, closely matched test control analysis. So let's actually walk through this and see what this looks like step by step. You first start with an open ended interview with the caregivers and with whoever is living with this behavior day to day. If it's the therapist, if it's teachers, if it's an aunt and uncle, you want to get all of the details from all of these individuals. And when I say open ended, I mean you're not just checking boxes on a rating scale, you're trying to understand the pattern. What's the perfect storm right before the behavior? And what does the behavior reliably produce? In the 2014 model, and also in later descriptions of practical functional assessments processes, interviewing isn't a one and done event. In another article by Raja Raman and colleagues, they point out that interviewing is an ongoing element of process because caregivers are often present during the analysis, and sometimes you have to ask follow-up questions if you don't get the functional control right away. So in the interview, you're listening for three things: what gets added or taken away right before the behavior, what the child does, and what changes immediately after. You're also listening for combinations. For example, it happens when I'm on the phone, and if I tell him no, if I try to get him to clean up. We're looking for the specific triggers, but we're also looking for multiple layers that might be building up on top of each other that are establishing the operation together for the behavior itself, right? So, really, what that means is that we're looking for the specific context in which this behavior is occurring. And then from there, you are trying to establish what is occurring before and afterwards so that you can establish a hypothesis, right? Once you've got that hypothesis, you build your control condition. And in this model, control is not just play in a generic sense like the FA analog. It matched to the specific interview results. The control condition is where you give the client access to full set of things that they are typically trying to get through the problem behavior that you're trying to reduce. And then you build the test condition. And this is where the word synthesized actually becomes concrete. In the test condition, you introduce the establishing operations that were described in the interview. You recreate precisely what is happening in the situation. And that might mean you remove attention, restrict access to preferred items, and place a demand all at the same time because that's what the family was doing. That's what the family was experiencing with the client, right? Then, if a problem behavior occurs, you deliver the synthesized reinforcer set contingent on the behavior. In other words, and non fancy words, the consequences also combined. You get attention back, access is restored, and demands are paused. Because this is real life, guys. When I'm giving demands to my child who's on tablet or he's playing a Switch, and I give him a direction to go clean up, what exactly is happening in that situation? I am removing access to the switch. I am placing a demand. And I might be removing the attention that he was getting from his sibling. In the synthesized model, you're not trying to isolate which variable is doing what. You're trying to confirm whether the combined contingencies, what caregivers actually describe, what they're actually seeing, is functionally related to the behavior. And I absolutely love this. If you want to go learn more about this strategy, go listen to my episode titled My Way Strategy, which goes over skill based training. But the thing to understand is that life is not a functional analysis in an analog box, right? Life is complex, it's messy. And when you are living with kids on the spectrum, you can understand this. I mean, if you're living with any kid at all, you can understand that life and the way that the behaviors function is complicated. And sometimes it's not about one specific thing, it's about the situation itself, the synthesized functions all together. All right, and then moving back into the steps, the final step is to confirm experimental control. And practically what that looks like is alternating control and test until you see a stable pattern. Problem behavior stays low in control and it is reliably increasing in test, just like in every other FA, right? However, unlike other FAs, synthesized FAs are completed in a relatively small number of intervals because you're really just testing out two at this point: test and condition. And the point is replication so that you can confirm, but that's all we're going for. You want to see a pattern that is strong and one that you can defend. But we are not judging between four possible functions and seeing the bars all over the place. We are saying this is the situation that triggers the behavior instead of saying this is the function that triggers the behavior. And if you don't get clear differentiation, if the behavior stays high in both or low in both, then the recommendation is you need to go back to the caregivers and return to an open ended question and refine the hypothesis and run another iteration until you do achieve functional control. All right, guys, that is our review of FAs. It is not a deep dive, but here is my call of action to all of you, and I mean this sincerely. Go learn functional analysis at a deeper level than I remember that condition from grad school, or I remember that type of FA from that podcast that I was listening to. Because if we don't truly know the function, if we don't know what's reinforcing and driving behavior, if we don't understand the exact situations leading to behaviors that's triggering them, then we're not writing protocols, we're writing guesses, likely educated guesses. And sometimes with more minor behaviors, that's oftentimes enough. But for more complex behaviors, guessing is expensive. It costs time, it costs family trust, and in worst cases, it costs safety. So whether you're running a full Iwata-style analog analysis, a brief FA, a precursor analysis, or an interview-informed synthesized approach like Hanley's, the point is the same. Stay function-based, stay defensible, and choose an analysis you can safely defend and be sure that you are responding appropriately to the behaviors in which you are seeing. The number of BCBAs in our field that are able to run an FA of any form seems to be decreasing day by day as new BCBAs are passing their exam. So my second challenge to you is this. If you've been working in this field for a while now, train your staff. Train your supervisees. They are the future of this field, and while we can say that FAs are complex, they are time-consuming, and they truly are not always necessary, they are an essential tool that we need to keep on hand, and we need to make sure that every generation of BCBAs has. Because when behaviors get complex, when situations aren't clear, and we put our interventions in place, we can risk great harm. FAs are not a solo sport, and we cannot be gatekeepers to this skill. It is a system-wide skill that all of us need. All right, and with that, we will start to wrap up. A quick reminder, this show is certified to provide CEUs. If you would like to get a CEU from this episode, go over to aba-ceus.com after you finish listening, click Get CEUs, and answer the 5 questions. Now remember, this has been a big change from the previous episodes which focused on keywords, but the process has remained the same. You answer the questions, they will be reviewed, and your certificate will be emailed out to you. And remember, processing time can vary a bit depending on how busy my kids are keeping me, but you'll get it delivered in your inbox within 24 to 48 hours. And if you like this episode, tell a friend, leave a review, share it with your students struggling to understand the different FA styles out there. And thanks for spending this hour with me and the work you're doing with the kids and families we serve. I'm Jay Burton, and as always, thanks for going beyond the data.
Bye, see you next time.